April 27th, 1943. The morning sun climbed over Galveston Harbour as Oberfeldwebel Karl Heinz Werner stood on the deck of the transport ship, watching the Texas coastline materialize through the heat shimmer. The 24-year-old Afrika Korps veteran, captured 3 weeks earlier at Cap Bon in Tunisia, gripped the rail with hands that still bore scars from tank combat. Around him, 300 German prisoners crowded the deck, their field-grey uniforms faded and torn, their faces gaunt from months of desert warfare and weeks of uncertainty at sea. Werner had fought across North Africa for 18 months. He had seen Rommel's panzers roll across Libya. He had endured British artillery barrages at Tobruk, watched American tanks advance at Kasserine Pass, felt the ground shake as Allied bombers pulverized German positions. Through it all, he had maintained faith in the Reich's ultimate victory. The propaganda had been clear. America was weak, decadent, divided. Its industrial capacity was exaggerated. Its people lacked the will to fight. Germany would prevail through superior discipline, superior weaponry, superior will. Now, as the transport ship approached the dock, Werner watched civilian vehicles moving along the waterfront. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Cars, trucks, commercial vehicles of every description, moving freely despite a war that had supposedly brought American industry to its knees. He squanned at the sheer quantity. In Germany, civilian vehicle production had been halted in 1942. Every factory produced war material. Yet here, 2 years into America's war, civilians still drove personal automobiles as if gasoline flowed from an inexhaustible source. The ship's engines throttled down. Dockhands secured mooring lines. American military police formed neat ranks on the pier, crisp uniforms gleaming in the morning light. Behind them, a convoy of pristine transport trucks waited to move the prisoners inland. Not captured vehicles, not repaired wrecks. New trucks, fresh from factories Werner had been told were struggling to meet wartime demands. The revelation came in stages, small observations accumulating into an unavoidable conclusion that would shatter everything Werner believed about America's capacity to wage war. Over the next 3 years, Werner and hundreds of thousands of German prisoners would experience a systematic psychological demolition as they encountered evidence of American industrial and agricultural abundance that rendered German propaganda not merely inaccurate, but laughably disconnected from reality. What began as captivity would become education. The camps themselves were lessons in American capability, and the lessons were devastating. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The journey toward this moment had begun 1 year earlier, when the War Department confronted an unprecedented logistical problem. After Pearl Harbor in December 1941, American forces expected to capture enemy prisoners, but planning focused on Pacific operations against Japan. Few anticipated the massive influx of Axis prisoners that would result from Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa in November 1942. The campaign unfolded with unexpected speed. Within 6 months, combined British and American forces had trapped Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's legendary Afrika Korps and hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers against the Mediterranean coast. On May 13, 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. More than 150,000 German prisoners fell into Allied hands virtually overnight, with 50,000 more captured in Sicily during Operation Husky that summer. Britain, already struggling to house prisoners from earlier campaigns, had neither the space nor the resources to accommodate this flood of captured soldiers. The solution was obvious. America, 3,000 miles from any combat zone, possessed vast open spaces, abundant resources, and minimal risk of prisoner rescue or escape. Beginning in April 1943, Liberty ships and troop transports began carrying thousands of German POWs westward across the Atlantic to detention in the American homeland. The Geneva Convention of 1929, ratified by 47 nations, including Germany and the United States, established specific protocols for prisoner treatment. Captive soldiers were entitled to adequate food, housing, medical care, and protection from abuse. They could be required to work, but must receive compensation. Officers could not be compelled to labor. Camps must allow religious services, educational activities, and communication with families through the International Red Cross. These provisions created legal obligations the American military took seriously, partly from humanitarian principle, partly from pragmatic recognition that German treatment of American POWs might depend on reciprocal respect for convention protocols. The War Department moved with characteristic American efficiency. Within months, 511 prison camps materialized across 45 states. The largest concentration emerged in the South and Southwest, particularly in Texas, which hosted more POW facilities than any other state. The Geneva Convention required prisoners be housed in climates similar to their capture locations. Since most German prisoners came from North African desert campaigns, Texas seemed appropriate despite the dubious logic equating Saharan heat with Gulf Coast humidity. Camp construction followed standard army patterns. Engineers selected sites near existing military installations or in rural areas where labor shortages were acute. They erected standardized barracks, mess halls, administrative buildings, medical facilities, and recreation areas, all surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers. The largest base camps could house 5,000 prisoners. Smaller branch camps, often housed in converted civilian conservation corps facilities, fairgrounds, or even school buildings, accommodated work details of 50 to 500 men. By June 1944, the American prison camp system held 281,000 German POWs. That number would peak at 372,000 by war's end, with an additional 53,000 Italians and 5,000 Japanese. The sheer scale of the operation was unprecedented in American history. Never before had the United States detained such massive numbers of foreign military prisoners. Never again would it face such a challenge. Werner and his Afrika Korps comrades boarded trucks for the journey inland to Camp Hearn, 90 miles northwest of Galveston, in the rolling prairie country of central Texas. The convoy traveled on smooth, paved highways that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Werner, accustomed to German autobahns but familiar with the devastated roads of North Africa and war-torn Europe, noted the excellent condition of American infrastructure. No bomb craters, no artillery damage, not even significant wear from military traffic. The highways were pristine. More disturbing was the civilian traffic. Cars passed the convoy regularly, driven by Americans going about ordinary business. Women drove alone, without male supervision. Teenagers drove to school or work. Families packed vehicles for recreational travel as if a world war wasn't consuming resources globally. In Germany, by 1943, only essential government and military vehicles operated. Civilian automobile ownership had become theoretical. Yet here, in a nation supposedly strained by war production, private citizens cruised highways in personal vehicles that appeared well-maintained and adequately fueled. The countryside itself presented another revelation. As the convoy passed through farmland, Werner observed agricultural operations on a scale impossible in Europe. Fields stretched for miles without interruption, planted with crops that showed no signs of neglect or labor shortage. Modern tractors worked the fields, not draft animals or hand labor. Silos bulged with grain. Cattle grazed in pastures that seemed inexhaustible. The abundance was staggering. German agriculture in 1943 was collapsing under the weight of war. Young men who should have been farming were dying in Russia. Horses that should have pulled plows were hauling supply wagons on the Eastern Front. Fertilizer production was diverted to explosives manufacturing. Food rationing grew more severe each month. Yet here, in America, agriculture appeared utterly unaffected by wartime demands. Camp Hearn materialized in the distance, a grid of white barracks and administrative buildings rising from the prairie. Guard towers marked the perimeter. Barbed wire fencing enclosed approximately 40 acres, but the camp itself looked substantial, permanent, well constructed. The barracks were not tents or temporary shelters, but wooden structures built to last. American soldiers guarded the facility, armed but not particularly aggressive. They looked well-fed, well-equipped, relaxed. The trucks stopped at the main gate. MP sergeants began processing the new arrivals. Werner and his comrades shuffled through intake procedures, surrendering remaining personal items, receiving prison identification, being assigned to barracks. The efficiency was remarkable. Forms were completed in triplicate. Records were meticulous. The Americans approached prisoner management with the same organizational precision they applied to everything else. Werner's barracks housed 30 men in 15 double bunks. The structure was clean, well ventilated, equipped with electric lighting and functioning plumbing, indoor toilets, running water. In Germany, many rural villages lacked such amenities. Here, in a prison camp for enemy soldiers, they were standard. Each prisoner received 3 wool blankets, a pillow, mess kit, and basic toiletries. The quartermaster explained, through an interpreter, that additional items could be purchased at the camp canteen using money earned from work assignments. The first meal arrived at 6 p.m. Werner joined the line filing through the mess hall, expecting meagre rations. What he received instead shocked him. The tray held substantial portions of beef, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz chicory blend German civilians had endured for years. The meat was fresh, not tinned. The bread was wheat, not the sawdust extended loaves becoming common in German cities. The vegetables were abundant, not the cabbage and turnips that dominated German rationing. Werner ate slowly, trying to process what this meal meant. The Geneva Convention required prisoners receive rations equivalent to the captor nation's garrison troops, but American propaganda, spread through Berlin radio broadcasts, insisted that American forces were poorly fed, that shortages plagued the home front, that the United States couldn't sustain its war effort. Yet here, on day 1 of captivity, Werner received better nutrition than he'd experienced in months of Afrika Korps service, better than his family received in Hamburg under rationing. That night, lying in his bunk, Werner confronted an uncomfortable thought. If American prison camps fed enemy soldiers this well, what did American combat troops receive? What did American civilians eat? How deep were America's agricultural reserves if it could provide such abundance to prisoners while simultaneously feeding millions of soldiers overseas and supporting allied nations through Lend-Lease? The answers would emerge gradually over the following weeks and months as Werner and his fellow prisoners adjusted to camp life and began work, assignments. What they would learn would fundamentally alter their understanding of the war, their nation's prospects, and the industrial disparity between Germany and the United States. The daily routine at Camp Herne followed military patterns familiar to German soldiers. Reveille at 6 a.m. morning roll call, breakfast, work assignments, lunch, afternoon labor, dinner, evening recreation, lights out at 10 p.m. The structure provided order and occupied time, reducing the idleness that might breed trouble. But within this routine, dozens of small revelations accumulated. The camp canteen sold items unavailable in Germany for years: cigarettes, chocolate, soft drinks, chewing gum, writing paper, soap. Prisoners could purchase these items using scrip earned from work assignments. The base wage was 80 cents per day, modest by American standards but representing more purchasing power than many German civilians possessed. Werner, assigned to agricultural work details, joined crews that boarded trucks each morning for transport to local farms, experiencing severe labor shortages. The war had drafted millions of American farm workers into military service, creating desperate demand for harvest labor. Farmers contracted with the War Department to employ German POWs, paying the government $1.50 per prisoner per day. The difference between what farmers paid and what prisoners received funded the POW camp system. The work was hard but familiar. Werner had grown up on a small farm outside Hamburg. He knew how to handle crops, operate basic equipment, perform the repetitive physical labor of harvesting. What shocked him was the scale of American agricultural operations and the mechanical advantage American farmers possessed. The first farm Werner's detail worked belonged to a family named Henderson, who cultivated 2,000 acres of cotton and 500 acres of corn. 2,000 acres. In Germany, a 200-acre farm was considered substantial. The average German farm in 1943 comprised barely 30 acres, yet here, a single American family, with no apparent aristocratic connections, operated land that would have supported an entire German village. The mechanization was even more impressive. Mr. Henderson owned 4 tractors, all relatively new, manufactured by John Deere or International Harvester. These weren't repurposed military vehicles or pre-war relics nursed along with improvised repairs. They were recent models, well-maintained, equipped with modern implements. Henderson operated them casually, as if tractor ownership was unremarkable rather than an indication of extraordinary wealth and industrial access. When Werner expressed surprise at the equipment, Henderson shrugged. "Lost 2 of my best hands to the army," he explained through the interpreter. "Had to mechanize or lose the crop." The casual tone was revealing. For Henderson, buying new tractors to replace drafted labor was simply practical problem-solving. He showed no awareness that German farmers would consider such equipment purchase impossible, that German agricultural mechanization had been frozen since 1941, that most German farms still relied on horsepower in the literal sense. The Henderson farm employed 20 German POWs during harvest season. They picked cotton by hand, filled enormous baskets, dumped the cotton into mechanical separators that Henderson operated. The work was exhausting under the Texas sun, but the prisoners received the same lunch the Henderson family ate, meals prepared by Mrs. Henderson and served at long tables under shade trees. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, iced tea, in Texas, in summer, while Europe rationed water in some regions. One afternoon, as Werner worked alongside Feldwebel Heinrich Kruger, another Afrika Korps veteran, Kruger voiced what both were thinking. "We were told America was on the brink of collapse, that their factories couldn't produce enough, that their farms were failing, that their people were starving. Look at this." He gestured at the endless cotton fields. "The modern equipment, the abundant lunch remains. Does this look like a nation losing a war?" Werner didn't answer. The question was rhetorical. The evidence surrounded them. America wasn't merely winning the war, it was winning while barely straining its economic capacity. The prison camps themselves proved it. Germany couldn't feed its own population adequately, yet America fed hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners better than German soldiers ate in the field. The psychological impact deepened when prisoners began receiving mail from home through the International Red Cross. Letters from Germany painted increasingly desperate pictures. Cities were being bombed regularly, food shortages were severe, clothing was rationed, fuel was scarce. Civilian morale was deteriorating. Werner's younger sister wrote from Hamburg, describing how the family now ate meals centered on turnips and potatoes, with meat appearing once every 2 weeks, with bread increasingly composed of non-wheat fillers. He read the letter while sitting in the camp rec hall after a dinner of roast pork, cornbread, coleslaw, and apple pie. The disconnect was surreal. His family was starving while he, a prisoner in enemy hands, ate better than he had in years of military service. Camp Herne, like most major POW facilities, offered prisoners surprising amenities. A lending library held several thousand books in German, supplied by the Red Cross and American religious organizations. Prisoners could take classes in English, mathematics, history, and vocational skills taught by fellow prisoners who had been teachers or professors before the war. Sports equipment was available, including soccer balls, baseballs, volleyballs. The camp had musical instruments, donated or purchased, allowing formation of small orchestras and bands that performed concerts weekly. Every Sunday, Catholic and Protestant chaplains conducted services. The German prisoners, mostly Christian, attended enthusiastically. The spiritual component of camp life helped maintain morale and provided continuity with civilian existence. Some prisoners later reported that they found their faith strengthened during captivity, that the forced pause from combat allowed religious reflection impossible in the chaos of war. The camp also published a newspaper, written and edited by prisoners, printed on equipment provided by camp authorities. Der Spiegel, they called it. The Mirror. It contained poetry, short stories, news summaries from American papers, announcements of camp events, and classified advertisements, where prisoners could trade or sell personal items. American censors reviewed every edition before publication, removing content that promoted Nazi ideology or might compromise security, but otherwise permitted remarkable editorial freedom. Through Der Spiegel and camp gossip, Werner learned about conditions in other camps. The stories were consistent. Prisoners everywhere reported being well fed, adequately housed, treated according to Geneva Convention standards. There were complaints, certainly. Prisoners wanted more contact with families. They resented confinement. They objected to work assignments they considered beneath their dignity. But none reported maltreatment, systematic abuse, or conditions comparable to what Allied prisoners endured in German or especially Japanese camps. This realization was itself instructive. The Geneva Convention created reciprocal obligations. Germany's treatment of American POWs should theoretically mirror American treatment of German prisoners. Yet, as 1943 turned to 1944, reports filtered through the Red Cross about deteriorating conditions in German POW camps. American airmen shot down over Germany were being held in camps with inadequate heating, insufficient food, minimal medical care. Ground troops captured during the Italian campaign reported similar conditions. The Wehrmacht, stretched thin and facing resource shortages, couldn't maintain prison camps to convention standards even when genuinely trying. America, fighting a two-ocean war, supplying Allied nations through Lend-Lease, suffering casualties in Italy and the Pacific, somehow maintained prison camps for hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers that exceeded minimum convention requirements. The disparity revealed fundamental differences in national capacity. Oberleutnant Friedrich Müller, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia and held at Camp Herne, articulated this understanding during an evening conversation in the officers' barracks. "We've been defeated," he said quietly. "Not by superior German courage or better tactics. We've been defeated by industrial mathematics. They can build more tanks than we can destroy, more planes than we can shoot down, more ships than we can sink, and they can do it while feeding us 3 meals a day and letting us play soccer on weekends." Müller's analysis, shared by increasing numbers of prisoners through 1944, represented a fundamental shift in perspective. These men had entered captivity, believing German propaganda about American weakness. Daily exposure to evidence of American abundance was systematically demolishing those beliefs. The transformation wasn't ideological conversion to American values or democratic principles. It was simply mathematical recognition that Germany had challenged a nation with resources so vast that victory was impossible. The work assignments reinforced this lesson repeatedly. Prisoners working in Texas cotton fields watched endless acres being harvested. Those assigned to lumber camps in Louisiana saw forests that seemed inexhaustible. Agricultural workers in California witnessed industrial farming operations that dwarfed anything in Europe. Construction crews, building roads, and dams observed American engineering capabilities deploying resources German planners couldn't imagine accessing. Werner, returning to Camp Herne after a long day picking cotton, would pass through the small town of Herne, Texas, population 7,000. The town had paved streets, electric streetlights, a functioning courthouse, multiple churches, stores with stocked windows, gasoline stations, an ice cream parlor, a movie theater. Life in Herne continued essentially unchanged by the war, except for missing young men in military service and the presence of German POWs working local farms. Herne, Texas, a town so small it barely appeared on maps, yet it possessed infrastructure and amenities that surpassed many German cities. And Herne wasn't exceptional. It was typical. Thousands of similar American towns dotted the countryside, all maintained, all functional, all displaying casual abundance that seemed impossible to prisoners from a nation where everything was scarce. The disconnect between propaganda and reality became impossible to ignore. German radio broadcasts, received occasionally by prisoners, continued claiming American imminent collapse. The broadcasts described factories shuttered by material shortages, farms abandoned for lack of labor, civilians rioting over food rationing, military morale crumbling under combat losses. None of it matched what prisoners observed daily. American factories weren't shuttered. They were expanding, building Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them, producing aircraft at rates that overwhelmed Luftwaffe defenses, manufacturing tanks and trucks that poured across Europe in unstoppable numbers. American farms weren't abandoned. They were so productive they fed not only the domestic population and millions of soldiers, but also provided food aid to Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. American civilians weren't rioting. They were experiencing rationing milder than German peacetime conditions while still maintaining living standards that seemed luxurious to European observers. The prisoners couldn't reconcile propaganda with evidence. Eventually, most stopped trying. They accepted observable reality over ideological claims. This acceptance marked the beginning of psychological collapse, not among weak men, but among soldiers who had fought effectively, who had believed in their cause, who had trusted their leaders. The evidence was simply too overwhelming. Werner, writing to his sister in late 1944, struggled to explain his growing certainty that Germany had lost. He couldn't explicitly state military conclusions because American censors read all outgoing mail. Instead, he wrote about his daily life, about the food he ate, about the well-maintained camp, about the agricultural abundance he witnessed. He hoped his sister would read between lines and understand what he was learning. Germany was fighting a nation with resources so vast that victory was mathematically impossible, regardless of German courage or tactical skill. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The autumn of 1944 brought new developments that further demonstrated American industrial capacity. D-Day had succeeded in June. Allied forces were advancing across France. Soviet armies were pushing westward through Eastern Europe. Germany was contracting on all fronts, its situation increasingly desperate. Yet in Texas, far from combat, German prisoners continued experiencing abundance that seemed disconnected from wartime reality. Camp Hearn received shipments of winter clothing in October. Each prisoner was issued a heavy wool coat, gloves, a knit cap, wool socks. The quartiermaster explained matter-of-factly that Geneva Convention required adequate cold weather gear. What went unsaid, but was obvious to every prisoner, was that America possessed textile, the production capacity to clothe not only its military, but also enemy prisoners in newly manufactured garments rather than captured stocks or worn-out surplus. The camp also expanded its educational programs. The Special Projects Division, a War Department program to re-educate German prisoners in democratic principles, launched in late 1943 but intensified in 1944. Camp authorities began showing films about American history and government, distributing books banned in Nazi Germany, encouraging discussions about democracy and individual rights. The re-education effort was subtle, avoiding heavy-handed propaganda that would trigger resistance. Instead, it exposed prisoners to American life through practical experience. Prisoners working on farms saw independent farmers making their own decisions about planting and harvest without government dictation. Those working in towns observed Americans speaking freely, criticizing government policies, voting in elections. The contrast with Nazi Germany's totalitarian control was obvious without anyone explicitly pointing it out. Many prisoners remained loyal Nazis, particularly those from elite units like the Afrika Korps or Waffen-SS, who had been captured early in the war during Germany's apparent success. These men organized resistance within camps, intimidated prisoners who expressed doubts about Nazi ideology, conducted secret tribunals that punished perceived disloyalty. The violence was real. Several prisoners were murdered by fellow POWs for defeatism or collaboration. American authorities struggled to identify and separate hardcore Nazis from other prisoners, but self-segregation was difficult when guards couldn't understand German conversations or interpret subtle political signals. Werner fell somewhere between fervent Nazi loyalty and complete acceptance of American superiority. He didn't renounce his service or claim to regret fighting for Germany, but he increasingly recognized that Germany's war aims had been unrealistic, based on fundamental misunderstanding of American capacity. He corresponded with Müller, the Luftwaffe pilot, and Kruger, his fellow Afrika Korps veteran, all three gradually accepting that Germany's defeat was inevitable regardless of battlefield tactics or soldiers' courage. The mathematics were inexorable. America produced approximately 40% of the world's manufactured goods in 1944. Germany, even controlling most of Europe, produced perhaps 15%. The Soviet Union added another 12% on the Allied side. Japan contributed 6% for the Axis. The arithmetic was crushing. The Axis nations were fighting enemies, controlling 2/3 of global industrial capacity. No amount of German tactical brilliance could overcome such disparity. American prisoners working in factories or visiting American cities saw this disparity translated into physical reality. Camp Swift, near Bastrop, Texas, sent work details to nearby Austin, where prisoners helped construct buildings at the University of Texas. They observed American university life continuing despite war. Students attended classes, professors taught, research continued. In Germany, universities had been militarized, their resources directed toward weapons development, their students conscripted. Other prisoners, assigned to work at military installations, witnessed American logistics capabilities that explained how materiel reached European and Pacific battlefields in such overwhelming quantities. At Camp Hood, near Killeen, Texas, prisoners watched endless convoys of newly manufactured tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces moving through the base for shipment overseas. The vehicles gleamed, fresh from Detroit and Cleveland factories. They weren't repaired battle-damage units. They were new production, arriving in such numbers that parking areas struggled to accommodate them. German industry, by contrast, was collapsing under Allied bombing. Factories were being systematically destroyed. Transportation infrastructure was degrading. Worker morale was deteriorating as cities burned. Production of tanks, planes, and ammunition was falling even as military demand increased. The Wehrmacht was forced to use captured equipment, horse-drawn transport, and improvised repairs to keep fighting. Meanwhile, America was producing equipment so fast it literally ran out of storage space. Werner heard about a phenomenon called depot reserves. American factories were manufacturing equipment faster than it could be shipped to combat zones. Rather than slow production, the military simply stockpiled surplus materiel in massive depots across the United States. These reserves ensured that combat units never experienced supply shortages. If a tank was destroyed, a replacement shipped within days. If ammunition stores ran low, resupply arrived immediately. The logistics network operated with precision that German soldiers, accustomed to chronic shortages, found impossible to comprehend. Conversations among prisoners increasingly focused on practical post-war concerns rather than military fantasies about German victory. By early 1945, with Allied armies crossing the Rhine and Soviet forces approaching Berlin, even the most dedicated Nazis privately acknowledged defeat was imminent. Discussions shifted to what would happen after surrender, how prisoners would be repatriated, what they would find when returning to Germany. The letters from home grew more desperate through winter. Werner's sister described Allied bombing raids that destroyed entire Hamburg neighborhoods. His mother wrote about food rationing so severe that families survived on bread and turnips. His father, too old for military service but working in a munitions factory, described production disruptions from missing materials and broken equipment. The letters painted pictures of a nation collapsing under war's weight. Meanwhile, Werner ate 3 substantial meals daily, lived in heated barracks, received adequate medical care, played soccer in his spare time, attended church on Sundays, took English classes in the evenings, and watched American guards who seemed relaxed and well-fed. The disconnect was total. Germany was dying while he, imprisoned in enemy territory, lived better than he had in years. May 8, 1945. The news crackled through Camp Hearn's public address system at 3 p.m. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The Third Reich had ceased to exist. Werner stood in the compound yard with several hundred other prisoners, listening to the announcement in stunned silence. For some prisoners, particularly those captured early from the Afrika Korps, the news brought relief mixed with sorrow. They had fought honourably, they told themselves, but the cause was lost. Better to accept defeat than see Germany completely destroyed. For others, especially younger prisoners captured late in the war, who had grown up entirely under Nazi indoctrination, the announcement triggered denial and rage. They insisted the report was Allied propaganda, that Germany would never surrender, that wonder weapons would still turn the tide. The camp commandant, Colonel James Matthews, addressed the prisoners through interpreters. "The war is over. You will remain in custody until arrangements can be made for your return to Germany. You will continue working under the same conditions as before. Any prisoner who refuses work assignments will face disciplinary action. That is all." The matter-of-fact tone was itself revealing. Matthews treated Germany's surrender as an administrative detail requiring procedural adjustments rather than a world historical moment. For the Americans, VE Day was cause for celebration, certainly, but the war continued in the Pacific. Japanese forces still held vast territories. The atomic bomb hadn't yet been used. American military. Focus shifted immediately to finishing the Pacific campaign, with European victory already becoming yesterday's news. For German prisoners, the psychological impact was profound. Everything they had fought for had failed. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. Germany lay in ruins, occupied by foreign armies, its cities destroyed, its infrastructure shattered, its population traumatized. The prisoners in Texas, comfortable and well-fed, faced returning to devastation beyond anything they had experienced during combat. Werner received a letter from his sister in late May. Hamburg had been bombed repeatedly. Their family home was destroyed. Their mother had died during a raid the previous summer, information the Red Cross had been unable to deliver earlier due to wartime disruptions. Their father was alive but injured, living in a refugee shelter. Food in Hamburg was scarce to the point of starvation. The British occupation forces were maintaining order but couldn't address the massive humanitarian crisis. Millions of Germans were homeless, hungry, desperate. He read the letter 3 times, trying to process the information. His mother was dead. His home was gone. His city was rubble. Meanwhile, he sat in a Texas barracks with electric lights and running water, having just eaten a dinner of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans. The guilt was crushing. He had survived the war in comfort while his family suffered unimaginable hardship. This guilt would haunt thousands of German POWs. They had been captured, transported to America, fed and housed adequately for 2 or 3 years while their nation was systematically destroyed. Many later described feeling that they had abandoned Germany in its darkest hour, even though their capture had been involuntary. The psychological burden was significant, but the guilt was mixed with a growing realization that their time in American captivity had probably saved their lives. Prisoners captured in 1943 and 44, had they remained with their units, would likely have died in the meat grinder of the Eastern Front or been killed during the Allies' final push through Germany. Instead, they had survived, healthy and intact, positioned to help rebuild when they finally returned home. The work assignments continued through summer 1945. President Harry Truman, facing labor shortages as American servicemen were demobilized and hoping to avoid immediate economic disruption, decided that German POWs would remain in the United States until the labor shortage eased. This decision, while pragmatic, meant prisoners would not return home for months, in some cases more than a year after the war's end. Werner and his work crew continued picking cotton and harvesting vegetables on Texas farms. The work was familiar now, almost routine, but everything felt different after VE Day. They were no longer enemy soldiers detained during hostilities. They were simply prisoners waiting for administrative processing, working because work was required, existing in a strange limbo between captivity and freedom. The farmers who employed them treated them increasingly like temporary hired hands rather than enemy prisoners. Mr. Henderson, whose farm had employed Werner's crew for 2 years, began including them in family conversations, asking about their plans after repatriation, expressing sympathy for Germany's situation. Mrs. Henderson packed extra food for them to take back to camp, homemade cookies and sandwiches beyond what Geneva Convention required. Some prisoners developed genuine friendships with Americans. Shared labor created bonds that transcended national enmity. Prisoners learned English and taught Americans German phrases. They exchanged stories about family, farming, ordinary life before the war disrupted everything. These connections humanized both sides, breaking down propaganda stereotypes on both sides. Not all interactions were friendly. Some Americans, particularly those who had lost family members in combat, remained hostile. Prisoners occasionally faced verbal abuse or minor harassment from guards or civilians who couldn't separate individual Germans from Nazi atrocities. But overt violence was rare, controlled by military discipline and American cultural norms that generally respected Geneva Convention obligations even toward enemies. The re-education programs intensified after Germany's surrender. The Special Projects Division, no longer constrained by concerns about violating Geneva Convention prohibitions against exposing prisoners to propaganda during active hostilities, launched comprehensive education efforts designed to introduce prisoners to democratic governance and counteract Nazi indoctrination. Camp authorities showed films documenting Nazi concentration camps. The footage from Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau shocked prisoners who had genuinely not known about systematic genocide. Many refused to believe the images were authentic, insisting they were American propaganda designed to demonize Germany. Others, confronting undeniable visual evidence of industrial-scale murder, experienced psychological crises as they grappled with their nation's crimes. Werner watched the Auschwitz footage in the camp theatre, sitting among prisoners whose reactions ranged from denial to horror to quiet tears. He had served in the Wehrmacht, not the SS. He had fought conventional battles in North Africa, not participated in genocide. Yet he was German, complicit by nationality in atrocities he hadn't committed personally, but that had been done in Germany's name. The films were followed by discussions led by German-speaking American officers trained in re-education techniques. The approach avoided direct accusation. Instead, facilitators asked questions designed to prompt self-examination. How had the Nazi Party gained power? What conditions in Weimar Germany had made totalitarianism appealing? How had ordinary Germans allowed dictatorship to replace democracy? What safeguards might prevent such transformation in the future? Some prisoners engaged genuinely with these questions, beginning the difficult process of examining their own beliefs and Germany's recent history. Others dismissed the entire exercise as victor's justice, refusing to accept that Germany bore unique responsibility for the war. The re-education program achieved mixed results. Studies conducted after prisoners' repatriation suggested that perhaps 30% underwent significant ideological change, another 40% shifted moderately toward democratic attitudes, and the remaining 30% retained authoritarian beliefs. But even prisoners who rejected democratic ideology couldn't deny the material evidence they had observed. Germany's defeat wasn't merely military. It was comprehensive collapse of a system that had promised greatness but delivered destruction. The contrast between American abundance and German devastation was too stark to dismiss. As summer turned to autumn in 1945, prisoners began hearing details about the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August. The technology shocked them. American scientists had developed weapons that could destroy entire cities in single explosions. The implications were staggering. If America possessed such weapons, what other capabilities remained hidden? How completely had Germany underestimated American scientific and industrial capacity? Feldwebel Kruger, Werner's longtime friend, articulated what many were thinking. We were fighting in the previous century while they were developing weapons for the next century. We had better tanks, perhaps, and our soldiers fought bravely. But they had industrial capacity and scientific research we couldn't match. They weren't just defeating us, they were obsoleting our entire way of war. The atomic bomb represented the ultimate vindication of American industrial strategy. While Germany had focused on producing incrementally better versions of existing weapons, America had invested in fundamental research that produced revolutionary capabilities. The Manhattan Project had cost $2 billion, an almost incomprehensible sum, employing thousands of scientists and engineers working in secret facilities across the United States. Germany, stretched thin by war on multiple fronts, couldn't have funded such research even if its leadership had recognized its importance. October 1945 brought news that prisoners would begin repatriation soon. The process would be gradual, prioritizing prisoners with families in immediate need or those with skills valuable for reconstruction. Officers would be repatriated first, as Geneva Convention prohibited their forced labor, and maintaining them served no useful purpose. Enlisted men would follow in groups organized by capture date and home region. Werner learned he would remain in Texas until at least March 1946. The delay frustrated him. He wanted to go home, to find his father, to help rebuild. But the American military moved at its own pace, constrained by shipping availability and processing capacity. Thousands of American servicemen were also being demobilized and transported home, taking priority over enemy prisoners. The winter of 1945–46 passed slowly. Prisoners worked shorter hours as agricultural demand decreased seasonally. They spent more time in camp, reading, taking classes, playing sports, waiting. The monotony was oppressive. They were no longer soldiers engaged in a cause. They were simply detained men counting days until release. Letters from Germany painted increasingly grim pictures. The winter of 45–46, remembered as the Hunger Winter, brought widespread starvation. Allied occupation forces struggled to distribute food to tens of millions of German civilians and refugees. The infrastructure was so damaged that even when food existed in one region, transporting it to starving populations elsewhere proved nearly impossible. Millions survived on fewer than 1,000 calories per day, well below subsistence levels. Werner's father wrote in January describing conditions in Hamburg. The city was 70% destroyed. Rubble filled the streets. Survivors lived in basements and ruins. Food came from occupation authorities' meager rations supplemented by foraging and black market trading. The Reichsmark was worthless. Barter economy dominated. A cigarette could buy a meal. A chocolate bar could purchase a day's labor. Reading these descriptions while living in heated barracks and eating regular meals, Werner experienced cognitive dissonance so severe it became difficult to process. His nation was dying while he, imprisoned in enemy territory, enjoyed security and comfort. The contradiction was unbearable. Other prisoners received even worse news. Millions of Germans had been expelled from Eastern Europe as borders shifted and populations were forcibly relocated. Families were separated. Men were missing, presumed dead in Soviet captivity. Women and children had fled westward, many dying during winter migrations. The humanitarian catastrophe was staggering. Some prisoners, learning their families had been killed or their homes were in Soviet-occupied zones they couldn't return to, experienced complete psychological breakdowns. Camp medical facilities treated increasing numbers of men suffering depression, anxiety, and trauma responses. The war was over, but the suffering continued. March 1946 finally brought Werner's repatriation orders. He would ship out from New York in mid-April, arriving in Germany sometime in May. The 3-year ordeal was ending. He packed his few possessions, said goodbye to friends who would remain longer, prepared for a journey into an uncertain future. The train journey from Texas to New York took 4 days. Werner watched American landscapes pass, observing one final time the vast agricultural expanses, the intact cities, the functioning infrastructure. America had fought a global war on 2 fronts and emerged stronger than when it began. Factories were converting to peacetime production. Servicemen were returning to civilian life. The economy was booming. Nothing was rationed anymore. Prosperity was returning. Germany, by contrast, had fought that same war and been destroyed. The comparison was devastating. At Camp Shanks in New York, prisoners went through final processing before boarding ships. Medical examinations confirmed they were fit to travel. Administrative officers verified identities and destinations. Red Cross workers provided care packages with food, cigarettes, and toiletries for the voyage. The process was efficient, impersonal, routine. Werner boarded the transport ship USS Eltinge on April 18th, joining 800 other prisoners for the Atlantic crossing. The ship had carried American troops to Europe during the war. Now it returned prisoners to a defeated homeland. The crossing took 9 days, rough seas making many men seasick, the cold Atlantic spray reminding everyone that spring in Europe would be harsh. The ship docked at Bremerhaven on April 27th, exactly 3 years after Werner had arrived in Galveston. The symmetry was striking. 3 years earlier, he had been a young soldier certain of German victory. Now he was a changed man, returning to a nation in ruins. The sight of Bremerhaven shocked prisoners who had been away for years. The city was devastated. Entire neighborhoods were rubble. The harbor, once bustling with commercial shipping, was cluttered with sunken vessels and damaged infrastructure. British occupation forces maintained order, but the destruction was overwhelming. Processing through British authority took hours. Each prisoner was registered, given identity papers, provided minimal rations, and released. Werner asked about transportation to Hamburg. An official explained that trains were running, but schedules were unreliable. Many bridges were destroyed, track repairs were ongoing, the journey might take days. He walked through Bremerhaven to the train station, observing German civilians who looked thin, worn, desperate. Women and children predominated. Young men were absent, dead or still in captivity. The population seemed broken, moving through daily routines with exhausted resignation. The train station was crowded with refugees, displaced persons, demobilized soldiers, and others trying to reach destinations across fractured Germany. Werner waited 6 hours for a train heading toward Hamburg. When it finally arrived, he crowded into a car packed beyond capacity, standing in the aisle with dozens of others for the slow journey north. The landscape outside the train windows was scarred. Bomb craters pocked fields. Villages were damaged or destroyed. Rivers lacked bridges, forcing circuitous routing. The infrastructure Werner had taken for granted before the war no longer existed. Germany had been returned to a pre-industrial state through systematic bombing. Hamburg appeared after 16 hours of slow travel. The city Werner remembered was gone. Entire districts had been burned to ash during firestorm raids. Buildings stood as hollow shells. Streets were canyons through rubble. Survivors had cleared paths for foot traffic, but vast areas remained impassable. Werner found his father in a refugee shelter, occupying a damaged school building. The reunion was emotional. His father had aged dramatically, thin and weak from malnutrition. But he was alive, and they embraced for long minutes, neither able to speak. Over the following days, Werner learned the full extent of his family's suffering. His mother had died in July 1944 during a bombing raid. His younger brother had been conscripted into the Volkssturm in late 1944 and killed during the Diaryofagermansoldier, final defense of Germany in April 1945, just days before surrender. His sister had survived but was caring for 2 orphaned children whose parents had been killed. Werner's return sparked complex emotions. Joy at being reunited with surviving family, mixed with grief for the dead, guilt over his comfortable captivity, and shock at Germany's devastation. He described to his father the abundance he had witnessed in America, the meals he had eaten, the infrastructure he had observed. His father listened quietly, then said simply, "We were fools to think we could defeat such a nation." This sentiment, shared by millions of German veterans, shaped post-war German attitudes. The direct experience of American capacity, whether through combat, captivity, or occupation, taught lessons that German propaganda had obscured. America wasn't weak or decadent. It was powerful beyond German comprehension, and that power rested on industrial and agricultural foundations that Germany couldn't match. Werner spent the following months helping rebuild Hamburg. The work was hard, the conditions grim, the progress slow. But gradually, order emerged from chaos. The Allies provided food aid that prevented mass starvation. The occupation authorities began infrastructure repair. German civilians, resilient and organized, started reconstruction with whatever materials they could salvage. The experience of American captivity shaped Werner's approach to rebuilding. He had seen democratic governance function effectively. He had observed Americans making decisions through discussion and consent rather than dictatorial command. He had learned English and acquired mechanical skills through camp education programs. These experiences made him valuable during Reconstruction, able to communicate with occupation authorities and understand American equipment and methods. Thousands of former POWs played similar roles. Their time in American camps had been involuntary education in democratic culture and modern industrial practice. Many became advocates for democratic reform in post-war Germany, understanding from direct experience that authoritarian systems had led to disaster while democratic nations had prospered. The contrast between German suffering and American prosperity haunted Werner for decades. In 1953, after the Federal Republic of Germany was established and restrictions on emigration were lifted, he applied for American immigration. The process took 3 years, but in 1956 he arrived in New York as an immigrant rather than a prisoner. He settled in Houston, Texas, not far from where he had been imprisoned. The irony was deliberate. He wanted to build his new life in the place where his old beliefs had been shattered. He found work as a machinist, sponsored by a church group that helped German immigrants. He learned to navigate American society, to understand its complexities and contradictions, to appreciate the opportunities it offered. In 1968, Werner became an American citizen. At the naturalization ceremony, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from German soldier to American citizen. The war had stripped away illusions about German superiority. Captivity in Texas had taught him that prosperity derived from economic systems and political structures, not racial mythology. America wasn't perfect, he had learned, but its fundamental approach, valuing individual freedom and economic opportunity, produced results that authoritarian systems couldn't match. Werner lived until 1998, dying at age 79 in Houston. He had married an American woman, raised 3 children, built a modest but comfortable life. He rarely spoke about the war or his captivity, preferring to focus on the future rather than the past. But in the final years of his life, as German and American historians began documenting POW experiences, he agreed to be interviewed about his time at Camp Hearn. The interview, preserved in the archives of the Texas Historical Commission, captured Werner's reflections on the psychological transformation he had experienced. "We went to war believing we were superior," he said. "We were taught that Germans were naturally better soldiers, that our discipline and organization would overcome any opponent, that America was weak and divided. Every day in Texas taught us we were wrong. The food we ate, the equipment we saw, the infrastructure that surrounded us, the casual abundance Americans took for granted. We had challenged a giant while deluding ourselves it was merely a large dwarf. The war's outcome was inevitable. We just didn't know it yet." This understanding, shared by hundreds of thousands of German POWs who spent time in American camps, influenced post-war German development. The Federal Republic, established in 1949, embraced democratic governance and market economics, partly because veterans who had experienced American society firsthand advocated these systems. They had seen democracy function effectively. They had observed that free societies could be more productive than controlled economies. They understood that Germany's future required abandoning authoritarian traditions that had produced disaster. The POW experience also shaped American attitudes. Communities that had hosted German prisoners, initially fearful and hostile, often developed more nuanced understanding of their former enemies. Farmers who had employed German labor frequently spoke positively about their workers' diligence and character. Civilians who had interacted with prisoners recognized that ordinary German soldiers were not fundamentally different from American soldiers. Both groups were young men caught up in events beyond their control. This humanization, modest though it was, contributed to relatively rapid reconciliation between America and West Germany during the Cold War. The two nations became close allies within a decade of the war's end, cooperating in NATO and supporting each other economically. This partnership would have been impossible if Americans had viewed all Germans as irredeemable Nazis, or if Germans had remained convinced of American inferiority. The German POW program in America represented more than temporary detention of enemy soldiers. It was an enormous, unintentional education program that exposed hundreds of thousands of Germans to American society at a crucial moment. The contrast between Nazi propaganda and observable reality was so stark that it forced psychological recalibration. Men who had believed German superiority was destiny learned instead that material capacity, industrial organization, and agricultural abundance determined outcomes in modern warfare. The lessons were harsh but necessary. Germany had started a war of conquest based on delusional beliefs about national superiority and enemy weakness. The reality, delivered through daily experience in prison camps surrounded by American abundance, demolished those delusions. German prisoners learned that they had been lied to, that their sacrifice had been based on false premises, that their nation's suffering resulted from leadership that had challenged an opponent it couldn't defeat. These lessons shaped Germany's post-war trajectory. The Federal Republic's founders, many of whom had military experience or had been affected by the war's outcome, built a democratic system designed to prevent another authoritarian catastrophe. They embraced Western economic integration, accepting that Germany's prosperity depended on cooperation with former enemies rather than military conquest. They committed to European unity, recognizing that peace required institutional structures preventing conflict. The success of post-war Germany vindicated the approach. From the ruins of 1945, West Germany rebuilt to become Europe's economic engine and a stable democracy. The transformation required 2 generations, but by the 1980s, Germany had achieved through peaceful reconstruction what it had failed to accomplish through military aggression: prosperity, influence, and respect. The POW experience contributed to this success by teaching a generation of German men that different systems produced different outcomes. The evidence was undeniable. America, fighting a two-ocean war, had maintained living standards that exceeded German peacetime conditions. It had fed millions of enemy prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers. It had produced war material in quantities that overwhelmed Axis industrial capacity. And it had done all this while preserving democratic governance and individual freedoms that Nazi Germany had destroyed. Werner's story, multiplied by 372,000 German prisoners held in America, represented a collective psychological transformation. These men returned to Germany with knowledge that challenged everything their education had taught them. Some rejected this knowledge, clinging to Nazi beliefs despite overwhelming evidence. Others accepted it gradually, allowing experience to reshape understanding over years. But most, eventually, acknowledged that Germany's defeat resulted from systemic weaknesses that authoritarian government had caused rather than prevented. The camps themselves stood as monuments to American industrial capacity. They appeared with remarkable speed, housed hundreds of thousands of prisoners adequately, provided medical care and education, employed German labor productively, and eventually returned most prisoners home healthy despite years of captivity. The logistical achievement was extraordinary. Germany, at the height of its power, couldn't have managed equivalent operations. The disparity revealed fundamental differences in organizational capability and resource access. Today, few physical traces of the POW camps remain. Most were dismantled after the war, their buildings sold or relocated, their land returned to civilian use. Camp Herne, where Werner spent 3 years, is now mostly empty prairie, with only a few foundation remnants indicating where thousands of men once lived. But the psychological legacy endures. The POW experience shaped individuals who shaped nations. The lessons learned in Texas cotton fields and Louisiana lumber camps contributed to building a democratic Germany that honored human rights and pursued prosperity through cooperation rather than conquest. The story of German POWs in America is ultimately about the power of observable evidence to overcome propaganda. Young men raised on Nazi mythology encountered daily reality that contradicted everything they had been taught. They couldn't dismiss this evidence because they lived it. The food was real, the infrastructure was tangible, the abundance was undeniable. Over months and years, accumulated observations forced reconsideration of basic assumptions about German superiority and American weakness. This process was painful. It required abandoning beliefs central to identity and purpose. It meant accepting that sacrifices had been wasted on a doomed cause. It involved recognizing that one's nation had committed atrocities in pursuit of delusional goals. Not all prisoners completed this process. Some died still believing in Nazi ideology. Others returned to Germany and tried to continue fighting lost causes. But many, probably most, emerged from captivity understanding that they had been wrong, that their leaders had been wrong, that Germany's path had led to disaster. Werner, standing at the naturalization ceremony in Houston in 1968, embodied this transformation. He had been an enemy soldier. He became an American citizen. The journey required abandoning everything he had believed as a young man and accepting uncomfortable truths about his nation's crimes and his own complicity. But it also offered redemption through understanding. He couldn't undo the war. He couldn't bring back the dead. But he could learn from experience and build a better life based on that learning. Millions of Germans followed similar paths. They rebuilt their shattered nation. They embraced democracy despite its unfamiliarity. They integrated with Western Europe despite historical enmities. They created prosperity through peaceful means rather than military conquest. The transformation took generations and required confronting painful truths about the past. But it succeeded, creating a Germany that honored human dignity rather than pursuing racial dominance. The POW camps played a small but significant role in this transformation. They exposed German soldiers to American society at a formative moment. The abundance they witnessed, the democratic governance they observed, the humane treatment they received, all contributed to understanding that different systems produced different results. This understanding, modest though it was, helped plant seeds that grew into democratic convictions. Werner's final interview concluded with a question about whether he regretted his wartime service. He paused, considering carefully. "I regret the cause I fought for," he said slowly. "I regret that my generation was misled by leaders who started a war we couldn't win, based on lies about who we were and what was possible. I regret the suffering inflicted on millions of innocent people. But I don't regret having survived to learn these lessons. The war taught me, painfully, that might doesn't make right, that propaganda obscures truth, and that building peace is harder but more rewarding than waging war. That understanding, shared by thousands of former POWs, shaped the Germany that emerged from ruins. It was purchased at terrible cost. Millions died, cities burned, families were destroyed, nations were devastated. But from catastrophe came wisdom. The generation that had waged total war built lasting peace. The soldiers who had fought believing in superiority learned humility. The prisoners who had experienced American abundance used that knowledge to build prosperity at home. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.